Welcome, everybody. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Melissa Terrace. I am the current director of UCL Centre for Digital Humanities. And 5 years ago this week, we launched UCL Centre for Digital Humanities. I'm going to read you our mission now to show what we said that we were going to do. Our mission is to champion, catalyse, promote, facilitate, undertake, advise and publicise activities in digital humanities with as wide an interpretation of that phrase as possible throughout the founding faculties and UCL in all areas of teaching, research, enabling and public engagement. Not much then, right? Over the past 5 years, we've been tremendously busy. All at once, it's no time at all, and a huge amount of time to get things done. We have brought in and been allied to research projects worth 20s of millions of pounds now. We've had some major successes. For example, we're involved in linguistic issues and the translation of domain names with Chris Dillon's work on the URL project. We're looking at giving people better access to census data for both migration research and for geographical research with Oliver Duke Williams. We're doing work with the art school and the Slade Archive project. That's me. We're looking back to the history of digital humanities as a discipline with Julian Nyan. We're looking at cultural aspects of European identity through large volumes of textual materials, really Tito. And we're reading archival materials using handwriting recognition technology, me again. And we're working very closely with computing science on doing some amazing graphics work, including uncrumpling old archival materials like the Great Parchment Book with Tim Virish. All of these things can be seen in our projects page. I had a choice here tonight. We could stand here, we could go through these type of projects. We could talk about the awards that we've won. For example, the awards for Transcribe Bentham, the Great Parchment Book, and the Day of Digital Humanities. And we could spend an hour just showing off. We could talk about our MA and MSc in Digital Humanities, which is a unique program where students can either do an MA, looking at the humanities aspect of digital humanities, or the computing aspect of digital humanities, or we could just have a party and we could all just celebrate. So we're thinking, we've had for these 5 years, we've really done all we've set out to do in these last 5 years. It's time for a party. And we had this choice of what should we do. Over the past 5 years, we've learnt a few things about digital humanities at UCL, and most of these things are very localised to our own institution. So it's important to us that we do good work in the digital as well as the humanities. We now report back equally to engineering science as well as the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, and we believe we're the only research centre in digital humanities that does that within the UK, if not the world. We believe in the importance of local context and building up things from our own special collections based on things like Transcribe Bentham, from what we've got in college, working with places like the Slade Archive and looking at what we've got locally that we can build upon. We believe in supporting the big projects that we're doing, but also the small ones and helping individual scholars get on the first rung of doing digital humanities research. We believe in good design and good presentation. The wonderful work of Rudolf Amann, our designer at large, you can see here today for UCLDH 5. And we also believe in bringing people together. There ain't no party like a DH party. So tonight we're all in one room. There's lots of people from across London who work in digital humanities. It's a time to get together, to discuss and to reflect on things. But instead of just me standing up for the next hour and showing off about how brilliant we are, we thought we would do something that looked to our past and where we came from, and also which looked to the future. One of the things that digital humanities as a subject area doesn't really have is the concept of named lectures. Now, these are common throughout the arts and humanities. They're a celebration of both a scholar's work and a means of promoting other people's work within that discipline. So we decided to set up a named lecture in digital humanities. And who should we name that named lecture after? Well, the answer was obvious. Professor Susan Hockey, who's here with us tonight. Why is this the case? Susan Hockey is the Emeritus Professor of Library and Information Studies at UCL and was Director of what was then the School of Library, Archive and Information Studies from 2001 to 2004. Before coming to UCL, she held positions at Oxford University, where she's an Emeritus Fellow of St Cross College, at Rutgers University and at the University of Alberta. She's been a leading light in the founding of humanities computing as a discipline, and as chair of the Association for Literary and Linguistic Computing from 1984 to 1997, she founded the journal Literary and Linguistic Computing, which is now the Journal of Digital Scholarship in the Humanities, and we have the editor of that journal here with us tonight, Edward Van Houtsing there. She has published widely on text analysis applications, markup, teaching, computing in the humanities, and the role of libraries in managing digital resources. In 2004, she became the third holder of the Busa Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award for the application of information and communications technologies to humanities research. She is the first recipient of the Susan Hockey Lecture in Digital Humanities, and we're absolutely delighted for that UCLDH 5 will be giving the first inaugural lecture by Susan Hockey today. We've been looking to the past, we're planning to the future, and I'm delighted here to welcome Susan Hockey to talk about digital humanities, perspectives on past, present and future.
First of all, I'd really like to say how surprised and honoured I felt to receive an email from Melissa about a year ago asking my permission to name this lecture after me, and also asking whether I'd be willing to give the first lecture. Well, of course, I couldn't say no. And I'd like to start by thanking Melissa and the UCL Centre for Digital Humanities for asking me, for all of you for coming, and I'd like to wish UCLDH a very happy 5th anniversary. Now, it's almost 11 years since I retired. I just hope I'm not too much out of practice. I live in the wilds of the Yorkshire Dales now, with a broadband speed that's only recently been increased from 1.5 meg to about 15. I do try to follow some things online, but I think inevitably this lecture will have a lot of generalisations and draw on my past experience, which was concentrated very much on text-based applications. I always felt it was difficult to keep up while I was working, but with the vast increase and multiplicity of activities described as digital humanities now, it seems to me that it's impossible for anyone very active in the field to keep up at all. I think the inevitable consequence is fragmentation, of which more later. Now, I've looked at the draft programme for the next Digital Humanities Conference to be held in Sydney, Australia at the end of next month. I can see 9 or 10 parallel sessions of papers of various kinds, albeit squashed into 2.5 to 3 days, and I guess some of you are going. But there are pre-conference events of work groups, subgroup meetings, other satellite events. I don't know how many papers were submitted for this conference, but I read that there were more than 700 for last year's in Switzerland. Now, what a contrast from the first conference I attended, which makes me feel terribly old, in Cambridge. It was in 1970. It was organised by Roy Wisby, who was then the director of the Literary and Linguistic Computing Centre in Cambridge, who then went on to be a professor of German at King's in London. I was very new to all of this. I'd recently graduated, my very first academic conference, and I was probably the youngest person there. But I had the privilege of meeting many of the pioneers in this field, and among them there are 3 on the screen there. Joe Rabin, who lived in New York for a long time, founded the journal Computers in the Humanities, which was in existence before the ALLC's journal. He did a lot of work on the Milton and Shelley. Wilhelm Mott in Tübingen was developing what looked like very interesting software for the analysis of classical text. And that really appealed to me because I have a background in Latin and Greek. And Antonio Zampolli, whom some of you may have met, who was, well, just Antonio or Zampolli to all of us, but he's somebody that those of us who've met will never forget. But he did a lot to promote our field. He had a lot of vision. And I think he was politically very smart in driving forward agendas that got money, which we're all interested in, and collaborative projects across disciplines. And sadly, out of those 3, only Wilhelm is still with us now. Now, Antonio started his career as a research assistant to the founder of our discipline. And I don't know how many disciplines can truly identify the one person who set them off. But in our case, this is definitely Father Roberto Busa. I had the privilege of meeting him several times. The last was at a workshop organised by the European Science Foundation in Strasbourg in the summer 2002. And the first thing he said to me was that he would be 90 the following year. Father Busa, as many of you probably know, he approached Thomas Watson of IBM for help in preparing his index Thomisticus, which was an index of about 11 million words of Latin. He had easily grasped the capability of machine assistance at that time, even though his text had to be prepared and stored on primitive technology. Now, in his foreword to the Companion to Digital Humanities that was published in 2004, this is what he said. In his mercy, around 1955, God left men to invent magnetic tapes. Until 1980, I was working on 1,800 tapes, each one 2,400 feet long, and their combined length was about 1,500 kilometers. So that was what it was like, even when I started, but I don't want to classify myself as too old. This was a vast improvement on the 13 million cards he thought he would need, because he thought they'd weigh about 500 metric tons. Now, the announcement of Father Busa's project is rather interesting. This was when he was planning to use index cards. And he started off, he was canvassing ideas from scholars, their opinion as to the need and usefulness of such an index as an aid to the study of medieval thought and language. Such views would be a source of great encouragement and guidance to him and to those who have offered to underwrite the project. Any information scholars can supply about such mechanical devices that would serve to achieve the greatest possible accuracy with a maximum economy of human labour. And the cost of this work will be underwritten by Italian industrialists. And this was all published in the journal called Speculum in 1950. But I think it all looks very familiar. If we're going to do a digital project, we need to find out what users want. We need to look for some software that delivers what's needed. And we need to get some money, or at least convince the powers that be that we've got some money. And that's exactly what he did to get started. And he got a lot of support. Father Busa was instrumental in leading the field in looking for better intellectual goals in our community. Well, we all know, obviously, computers can count words or repeating strings of symbols very easily. We've still seen it in all these word clouds produced in the recent election. But of course, what they cannot do easily is look beyond the sequences of symbols. Father Busa wanted to list his words under dictionary headings, and he wanted to avoid ambiguity. And he didn't have any software to do it. We know it's still pretty difficult now, and so he did it by hand. He didn't just take what the computer could do for him, he questioned it, and he wanted to see how he could make it better. He started to think about other forms of linguistic analysis. And this is a bit of a mouthful, but I think it really encapsulates what he was about. The major obstacle lies in the semanticity of words, which is deeply different from that of numbers and symbols. Furthermore, we do not speak in words, but in sentences. A sentence has a global meaning, which is not the pure sum of the values of its single components. Then he says, I'm not sure whether artificial intelligence will eventually solve this problem. Well, if any of you are working in AI, you know where we've got to with this kind of thing now. And this was he wrote in 1980. Just one more instance of Father Busa's foresight and village. I was at a conference he gave in Oxford, a conference where he gave a keynote in Oxford in September 1997. And he was 83 then, only 4 years after the first graphical browser appeared on the web. And he was talking a lot about the possibilities of the World Wide Web and hypermedia. Well, that's not bad when you're 83 and you've been in this right from the beginning. But I want to go back to this conference in Cambridge, though I'm aware that there were some things going on before there. But this was a group of about 70 people. I think there were about 30 papers. And almost all of the people were working on their own individual research projects. Some people, like myself, were developing software to assist them. The technology was limited, texts created on paper tape, where you couldn't see what you've typed, or on punch cards, where there were only uppercase letters. But I think that some of the intellectual problems that were discussed in that conference will still exist. How do you encode complex texts? How do you, or even should you, represent interpretation of literary texts? What do you do if you try to get beyond the text being considered only as sequences of symbols? How do you represent and process material written in non-Roman alphabets and generate results in them? And that's what I was doing when I started, trying to write some programs to write Arabic on an ancient graph plotter. But this was very much a text-based community at that time. Time moved on. The Americans began a regular series of conferences in alternate years described as computing in the humanities. And they had much the same range of papers and a similar range of intellectual problems. Much of the work was based on word counts and concordances, what's often been called the computation of style. Scholars experimented with various statistical tools to determine variations in style, and sometimes to investigate questions of disputed authorship. Now, this kind of work predates computers by a long time, going back to Augustus de Morgan, who was actually a professor of mathematics here at UCL. And on August the 18th, 1851, he wrote a letter to an old friend in Cambridge suggesting that if you run your eye over any part of those of St. Paul's epistles, which begin with Paulos, the Greek I mean, he says, and without paying any attention to the meaning, and then do the same with the epistle to the Hebrews, and try to balance in your own mind the question of whether the latter does not deal in longer words than the former. It has always run in my head that a little expenditure with money, we're back to money again, would settle questions of authorship in this way. Well, it doesn't appear that he followed up his suggestion, and I guess he didn't get the money. But it was taken up later by an American physicist, T.C. Mendenhall, who also adapted it to investigate frequencies taken from samples from some English novels. And he employed two ladies to count 400,000 words. Can you imagine it? Samples from English novels. And they had a kind of machine with a lot of buttons on it. When they got to a one-letter word, they pressed a button with a number 1, and a two-letter word, a button with a number 2, and so on. This all seems quaint, barely believable, but if you want to read up his articles, they're quite entertaining. But the bottom line is he had some research questions, and he was using a mechanical aid to try to answer them. And isn't that what we're all doing now? With a few notable exceptions, research based on word frequencies and distributions, or computation of style, as Anthony Kenny called it, went out of fashion for a long time, perhaps because of the advanced statistics needed. But there seems to have been a recent revival, and I've seen mention or reference to quite a lot of papers of people working on this kind of thing now. And I'd be really interested to know what all these people who've started up doing this recently think about these earlier projects and what they can make of them. But literary analysis was only a small part of the application of statistical analysis to text. By far the largest area was the study of language in order to develop language analysis tools. That's in corpus analysis and computational linguistics. Now, very early on, it was thought that machine translation would be possible. And a lot of effort and money was poured into it, but this was killed off by a report that some agency of the US government commissioned and was produced in 1966. But they did recommend doing more work on computational linguistics, tools to aid translation, and the machine understanding of text. And we can see all of this today now in voice input, for instance, Apple's Siri, in automatic extracting and dictionaries and the like. So, though the statistical analysis of style has really been a kind of niche area in humanities computing, a lot of the tools that it's developed, we see the results of these now in everyday life. Now, many of these early practitioners were humanities scholars based in humanities departments. A lot of them put their careers on the line by starting to work with computers. Others were more established scholars who would risk dabbling with relatively unknown methods and tools. So it's a completely different community from what we are now. But I want to show a little bit about how we've arrived at the kind of community we are now. Until the arrival of word processors, many were the only person in their department using a computer. And the only way they got to meet other people doing it was to go to a conference on it, where everybody suddenly found a rooms full of like-minded individuals after being the only person in their own department doing anything. There's always been a friendly and welcoming atmosphere at these conferences, and I believe that's still carried on, I hope very much. Everyone was on more or less on equal terms, and those who worked on the technical side were recognized as being the crucial to outcomes and the success of projects. People were excited about the possibilities, and there was a strong sense of striving to make things happen and make things better. And at this time, there were a couple of associations were formed just to give a little bit of support to these very isolated communities. But these people carried on, numbers grew. And what happened during this time was emerged was a need to avoid reinventing the wheel. There was a need for general purpose software, need for finding a way of archiving electronic resources so that the effort in creating them was not lost once the individual user had finished with them. Now, this was still going way back in history in the days of mainframe computing before any internet. So if you wanted to use the computer, you had to go to the computing center, and there was somebody there who knew about all these software programs. And they would know if somebody else in the institution had the same methodological needs, even if their data was very different. So it generated quite a bit of cross-fertilization of ideas within one particular institution. Because, for example, the procedures used by social scientists for studying, analysing speech, vocabulary, and the like were exactly the same as the ones used by the literary people. The tools for making indexes and the like were the same, and general-purpose tools like the Oxford Concordance Programme began to emerge, and there was quite a community of using them. From the late 1970s as well, groups of scholars and some centres began to create, collect and distribute electronic texts, particularly those that individual scholars who'd carried out whatever research they wanted to do with the text. When they'd finished with them, they'd moved on to other things. Now, this is beginning to lead into what's happening now with large collections of texts. These data collecting organisations had a pretty good idea about what researchers might want to do with the text, but they really had much less expertise in documenting them and maintaining them for the future. And it was some time before a more centralised approach to this emerged. And I'd always say it was a pity that an organisation like the Arts and Humanities Data Service was effectively closed down. It made more sense as it could start to do research on metadata across disciplines and data types. And also what grew out of this was a need for a common encoding scheme, multi-purpose and incremental encoding. Most of the early people devised their own encoding scheme, and it worked well for them. But they knew so much about it, they never bothered to write down about what exactly it was. So if anybody else wanted to use it, they hadn't a clue what all these funny symbols meant to be in the text. Programs like the Oxford Concordance Programme accepted some schemes, including overlapping hierarchies, which you can't do easily in XML. But the need for a common encoding scheme was recognised, and a very small community of humanities computing people got together to try to create one. There was a planning meeting in New York, or Poughkeepsie, upstate New York, in November 1987. There were about 30 people there. And they came up with these things called the Poughkeepsie principles, the principles on which a new encoding scheme would be created. And this led to the Text Encoding Initiative, which I still think has been one of the largest collaborative projects within digital humanities. To put it bluntly, it was a huge baby for a small group of people to deal with. The TEI addressed plenty of intellectual problems in encoding texts for different purposes. And it tried, with some success, but not entirely, to bring in the library community, the people who know about how to document resources and how to look after them. And it made the first attempt at defining a way of describing electronic texts with metadata. Now, to look at this from a sort of management perspective, there were people in about 12 countries doing some work. How on earth do you organize them? There was money from the US National Endowment for the Humanities, the largest amount of the money, some from the European Union, nice chunk from the Mellon Foundation with no strings attached, and some from national funding bodies and individual projects. And those of us who were involved with these had quite a struggle to get to grips with organizing all of this. And all these people had different funding requirements, different budget headings, etc. And we'd only just started using international email. But we thought we could run a project like this by email. But in fact, we soon discovered that you can't. You get far more work done if you have people in a room, face-to-face, round a table. And this was quite a cost with people from both sides of the Atlantic. TEI began before XML came on the scene. It was an early adopter of generic markup, and the first version of the guidelines were in SGML. The entire project had to move to XML as soon as it could. However, I do think that, especially considering the size of the community that devised it, there were about 200 people interested and about 30 actually doing some work. This thing has had considerable influence. We can see it in large-scale text collections everywhere. Most electronic dictionaries are based on it. To some considerable extent in journal publishing. And for the archivists, the encoded archival description, the EAD, derived a lot of its ideas from the TEI, particularly the idea of a document header which contains cataloguing information about the finding aid, as well as the documentation of the encoding itself. Well, then we had the big switch with the World Wide Web, and I guess most of you, not too many people in this room can remember what life was like before it, but it was something completely different. The first graphical browser, Mosaic, appeared in 1993. That's what, 22 years ago? And there was a huge shift towards delivery of resources. Now, I think I can stand up and say this now, that initially quite a few parts of the people who were working in digital humanities, called humanities computing them, were quite sniffy about HTML, because they devised this huge and complex encoding scheme which did exactly what they wanted. And now they have this thing which everybody's starting to use, and it didn't follow the holy grail of generic markup, certainly not the early versions of it. And it seemed to more mimic the problems of word processors for representations. That's, of course, giving you ambiguity, witness the multiple uses of italic or quotes. But for a long time, there were no delivery tools for the TEI, and HTML's developed into what it is now. But I still think it's a bit odd that nearly everything you have to deliver on the web is converted into this rather curious encoding scheme at the end. But I suppose that's what happens when things develop incrementally, when big business controls most of the browser technology. But with the web, you weren't stuck with the limitations of print publication. You could publish your material immediately. You could amend it and update it as much as you want. You could include as much as you want with no constraints on printing costs. You could have images, sound, and video. You could believe you were totally in control of it, and you could reach an audience beyond academia. And all this was very attractive to editors of scholarly editions who thought they could include all versions of a text. But how do you represent the intellectual input that goes into a scholarly edition? How do you explain the reasoning behind your decisions? Or do you, as quite a few people tried to do, present all the versions and not call it an edition? And the big question, which rarely seemed to be addressed, was how on earth do you start? And in the 1990s, when I was living in America, I went to a lot of meetings with scholarly editors. And it was very theoretical, which was very nice. But if you sat them in front of a computer, which button do I press now? And we had quite a bit of that. So they could learn, really find out what sort of technical knowledge they needed to do this. And who's going to do all that work to create all those manuscripts? And what can be done to make the creation of it easier? Now, archives of collections of source material began to emerge on the web as well, created by more groups of humanities scholars. But they were still fumbling around on how to describe what they created and how to maintain it for the future. Now, I expect everybody here knows how much easier it is to get money to build something than to maintain it afterwards. And traditionally, it's been the role of the library to maintain and provide access to information. But it was still some time before libraries and archives became fully engaged in how to deal with electronic resources. So where are we now? My remarks now inevitably come from the perspective of somebody who stepped back a bit. But since I've retired, I spent a lot of time browsing, following my own interests, which do include some things which don't perhaps normally fit the sphere of academia. I don't think it's any longer necessary to say much about access to electronic resources, particularly second ones. I can find all the journal articles I want without moving from my sofa. And living where I do now, that's a big advantage. I can also find a good number of primary sources, but the coverage here is patchy, and it's sometimes incomplete. And it's never easy to know how complete something is. Contrast this, if you have a printed book in front of you, you can see the finite book, and its scope is clearly visible. I'd like to follow links more directly from an article to items in its references, and that's getting a lot better. But it doesn't always work as well as you want, particularly in the humanities, and especially when you come to a monograph. Now, sales of monographs are declining, and students certainly can't afford to buy them, nor can many libraries. But I tend to think they're really too large to handle easily in a digital environment. You can search and go to a specific place in a monograph, but in a longer, more discursive text, you really need to read more of the argument. This is completely different from a reference work, which is such an obvious thing for a database. And I guess monographs live on now as they're vital components for research assessment and tenure applications. But there is something quite satisfying about writing and getting published a whole book about a topic, not just bits and pieces in journals. But what is clear now is that we're in a huge landscape of all kinds of different technologies. We use these new technologies every day. We're all taking digital images all the time. We're all listening to digital audio on our iPods or whatever latest gadget we've just got. We all watch video streamed from various sources. There must be thousands of radio stations on the internet now. And goodness knows how many videos on YouTube. I did a slightly silly thing, I suppose, last week. I put digital humanities into the search box in YouTube, and it said there were 35,500 results. Now, where on earth do you start with all of this? I imagine most of these are for marketing, but which one should I look at if I want to learn more about DH? You have to get yourself near the top of the list. One thing I've noticed, I'm quite a fan of the BBC website, news website, except I used to be, and now they've revamped it all for tablets, and there's far more audio and video appearing on there. And presumably that's a lot easier for them because that's how they record things, or they make the little clips for the television. But it's a lot more difficult to skim audio and video than it is to read something. And I find it quite annoying. If something's on a little video clip, I usually just move on unless I really want to find out what it's about. If the text was there, I would have read it. And the final one here is digital maps. Our household's quite keen on maps. We've got hundreds, and we've got a sat-nav. But we don't yet have a handheld GPS, and I guess we will fairly soon. But maps are essential for archaeology and history. But potentially all this stuff is data for research, for user studies, analysis of information-seeking behavior, and the like. And more potential, well, specifically within the humanities, there's a huge potential for imaging, and I know that's one of the areas that Melissa's done a lot of work in. First of all, simply the virtual gallery. I mean, the days when you had to put together a collection of slides to give students a lecture on art history are long, long, long gone. But also for image manipulation enhancement. There are plenty of examples around now for clarifying illegible parts of manuscripts, examining fine detail in museum objects and using 3D. In audio, besides music, there's dialects, oral history. But if you want to study those in detail, how do you make a digital representation that you can analyze? I don't know much about digital music, but for dialect studies and oral history, you do really need a transcription and tools to help with making this transcription. But are we really there yet with speech recognition and voice input? The language technology behind these applications relies on a combination of rules and dictionaries. But the dictionaries are needed for dialects are not the same as modern day usage. And more often than not, you want to link information sources in all of these technologies to create a resource. How do you do it? What sort of metadata is needed? And if somebody just wants part of it, can each component carry its own metadata and be used easily? Now, I don't think the idea of putting the entire cultural heritage online now is completely fanciful. I think it will happen. When I lived in America, I went to quite a few library meetings, and there was a talk given by a senior librarian in one of the main universities there, talking about putting the entire library online in the 1990s, and everybody thought it was a joke. But it's happening, absolutely. And so I think this is going to happen at some stage with the cultural heritage. There are issues of scalability, or one of the in phrases, big data, working on that. But there needs to be other information to help people read it. And there are a whole lot of metadata issues still. How do you make many different data formats for many different users? Can each discrete data item carry its own metadata? And then that raises the question, what exactly is the data item? It could be almost anything. The language technology people will put a data item as being a single letter, or you can have a huge object. So you have to think about how we're going to handle that. There are so many different users now, and this is what I've really learned since I retired. There are many more, ranging from school children to the silver surfers. But in higher education, speaking to a user community in higher education and related organizations, it's to some extent inevitable when peer review and tenure are so important. But I think there's a huge audience out there for digital humanities, from the school children to the silver surfers, and almost anywhere in the world. There's still a digital divide to some extent, but I think anywhere in the developed world can use the internet if they want to. They perhaps need a bit of enticement and a bit of training, but this is a generational thing, and it's going away already. And countries in the developing world are moving straight from no phones to smartphones with satellite links. Now, the diehards who don't want to know will soon no longer be around, and I think at some stage the digital divide will disappear. Now, the cultural heritage is of interest to a lot of people. It's all around you, and it's easier for a layperson to deal with than detailed scientific research. People want to see things and to learn. The large numbers of volunteers in the cultural heritage section, I can mention local museums, libraries, in archaeology, the National Trust. A lot of them haven't grown up with computing, but this will change over the years. I really wonder whether these people can be put to work on some digital projects. They'll need some training and a bit of supervision, but we know more about how to do this now and what sort of tools can help them. An example here at UCL is the Transcribe Bentham project. I've read some of the papers about that. The idea of using a distributed effort for resource creation has been around for a long time, well before the term crowdsourcing was coined. But you can't really do it at all without the internet and tools to help the transcribers. Another thing that caught my eye last week was on the BBC website about their lost historical artifacts in Iraq. They were sending requests out to tourists, asking them to send in any photos they'd taken of these things and trying to reconstruct them. But the real issue then is how to meet the right people. I read that an article in the New York Times did the trick for Transcribe Bentham. But once you've got them, you can use Facebook and Twitter to keep in touch. And when we were doing the Leaders Project 12 years ago, if you need a focus group for testing a resource for the more general public, the Silver Surfers will come just for the cost of free lunch. They're very cheap because they all use their bus passes to get there. At the other end of the spectrum, digital resources are now used a lot in schools, even at primary level and before school age. So it gets back to the question of, can you reuse the same resource at all levels, from young children to advanced research? Can you tailor it for particular needs by applying some general purpose software? It would ultimately save a lot of duplication of effort if it could be done. And the master version would have to be deliverable to a range of devices, tablets, smartphones. I'm not sure I want to look at the cultural heritage on a smartwatch, but eventually I suppose I will. At the other end of the spectrum, the internet and television are converging. I want to talk about another aspect as well, which is something I've learned as I've gone along, to do with management of digital projects. Collaborative working, which is a new dimension within the humanities, and that in turn introduces quite a lot of management issues. What skills do you need in the team? You often have to rely on the technical people to decide whether something can be done or not. And then there's the absent project director. I hope none of you are this person. The project director needs to get involved. I really think so. How much time can they devote to it? You can obviously use the technology to maintain the documentation and whatever resource you're creating. But what's the decision-making processes again? And as I said earlier, isn't the complete solution. I don't know how much you can achieve now with internet video conferencing. It certainly saves time and money. And how do you organise the work? I quite like the European Union system of work packages, which are discrete bits of work from different partners. Working practices are different in different subject areas, and that could create problems with different departments in the same institution, and it's nice to see there's a lot of cross-departmental collaboration here. But you have to be more careful across institutions and international boundaries. And then what format does your publication take? And I think digital humanities seems to have reached a reasonable compromise between the kind of discursive article with many footnotes that you see in a humanities publication and a typical scientific paper with many authors, lots of references, and a conclusion which is more a summary than a critical reflection. Project management, I said, can be new to some, but I think if you don't have any management, even if it's very informal, you're unlikely to have a viable project. Dare I talk about digital humanities in the institution? This has been a perennial debate. Here I just offer some thoughts. And basically, I think it really depends on who in the institution's driving it, who the people are. If you set up a centre within an individual humanities department, you can be very dependent on 2 or 3 people whose interests are likely to be the focus of its activities. This is all very well until they retire or leave. So you need, obviously, a core of people to keep things going. Teaching programme gives a lot more stability, particularly if they're there for several years. I think it's important for senior management to try to get some understanding of what this is about. And Probably even now, quite a lot of the people in very senior positions in universities have not grown up with computers. This will go away, but I think it's probably the case now. These senior managers like activities that bring in grant money, but they like to see visible results. And that's not so good if you're doing methodological research, because you don't have a lot to show for it in terms of a project with pretty pictures on the screen. On the other side, there can be a bit of resentment from the departments that lost some people and find their posts have been allocated somewhere else, particularly when they see money arriving with these new jobs. But you can't stand still. And I don't see how any small or medium-sized unit can attempt to cover more than a small amount of what's going on now in digital humanities. It makes sense to concentrate on a few aspects. You go along with the skills of the people already there. And I've worked in a whole range of different departments. I've worked in a computing centre, I've worked in a library, I've been in an English department, and I finished up in an information studies department. And there I felt, in fact, happier in many ways. I had more in common with the other people there. But again, this varies very much from one place to another. But information studies is about creation, management, and manipulation, maintenance of information objects. And the management is one thing that information departments are really good at. I mean, that's basically what they do. And it's one area where the digital humanities was floundering quite a lot to begin with. I just want to talk a little bit about the other organisations which are repositories of information. The libraries have been around for centuries with managing static information objects. But I think they were initially caught off the hook with the electronic resources because they didn't really fit into their established systems. What do you do if you get a magnetic tape or a CD-ROM? There's a slight tendency to dust it off and make a catalogue record and stick it on the shelf. But then somebody comes along and wants to use it, and they need help. And initially, providing software wasn't really the role for libraries. Now we have large collections of electronic texts, most of which are provided by publishers through the conduit of the library. And the advantages of access for these are very obvious. But I really wonder, should we be constrained by what the publisher's choice of software wants to do? It's mostly fine for retrieval for secondary sources. But the history of computing in the humanities shows that that's not the only thing you want to do with a primary source. Archives have done a lot of excellent work in providing online finding aids to collections, and I've been dabbling in a few of those since I retired. But I'll say again, using a system modelled on what the digital humanities community did. And now they're putting more documents online. Archivists always told me that as soon as the finding aids went online, they were swamped with people just coming to the archive. So the next stage is to get the documents online with images, which is happening at the moment. It's considered to be too expensive to make a good transcription. So this is another area where the crowdsourcing could be put to work. The ideal is to go from one to the other. We need to try to find some better software tools for doing that. But what about the future? I think there's inevitably going to be more fragmentation. But we've had this for a long time. There have been groups of people looking at computers in archaeology, music, art history, linguistics and the like. There's going to be fragmentation by technical method, markup, 3D, statistics for language analysis. So I think the big challenge is how to get interaction between these groups. If you go to a conference and you present a paper on an area that isn't well represented, you probably won't go again unless you've got some multi-purpose technology and feel capable of understanding a commonality of methodology with other papers. Now, I'll come up front. I'm not a big fan of large conferences, and I tend to think the bigger the conference is, the fewer sessions you go to. But they are important for sharing interdisciplinary issues, and I think there's room for the big and small conferences, and you obviously need funding for both. And I just wanted to finish up talking about teaching, which is something I'd done odds and ends of courses before I came to UCL, but I never taught on a degree program for any kind of computing or information in the humanities. And this is all about the next generation. It's mostly at master's levels. I was interested to see who the students were. Why might on earth they want to do this? I think only a few are considering an academic career. Some of them are doing it in a way to get more skills and become employable. When I was here, most of our students had had some experience. They were seconded by their employers or they were self-taught through some interest of their own. And the degree was an opportunity to build on what they'd already knew and to reflect on it and to gain confidence in an ability to make informed choices. And I really like the mixed group, particularly with a strong contingent of international students as well. What to teach has been debated forevermore. Opinions have varied for a long time about the amount of technical content and exactly what form it might take. This is the debate about doing it or talking about doing it. And there's been a lot of this camp or that camp on those. I think they should both be there. They're really important that students can build a resource and talk about what they did when they were building it. And the talking about is actually really helpful to somebody marking it, particularly when it doesn't work. What they do is actually less important, provided they've done it. Basic module can tend horribly to be a sort of cook's tour, but what do you do when people have come from all kinds of backgrounds? You try to bring in the critical reflection. Two things I liked about the teaching were the group project, which Claire over there explained to me what she was going to do for that. I thought it was great that they self-select, do a project in small groups. They have to decide for themselves who's going to do what, and then they have to make a presentation, and then they have to write it up individually. And they learn a lot from doing that. And the work placement, I think, is good for people here in London. There's so much opportunity, and it's a big, big advantage of being in London. I can tell you from when I lived in the wilds of Canada, even with a lot of multimedia companies there. I think institutions need to understand what's involved in running these programs. It's not like another humanities subject where you can dust your lecture off and turn up again the next year. The technology changes and it's got to be updated regularly, and you need the technical support. But there's a growing area for teaching, but they said the workload can be quite heavy, technical support, placements, and all those master's dissertations. Try and put them to work doing something interesting. Now, there are all kinds of options for students afterwards, and I was pleased to see that so many students go away to do so many different things, not just in digital humanities, but publishing, any kind of website management in the cultural heritage, web editing, internet marketing, and the like. There are a host of jobs that they can do. Now, what about the MOOCs? I've been looking around at these a bit as well. I don't know whether UCL has any. I see it's just joined FutureLearn. There's a huge demand for learning, and certainly I found that again since I've retired. I've been dabbling a bit in things I shouldn't really be dabbling in. But it's made me see the other side of the fence very well. How much is involved in putting on a distance learning course? I just wonder about coping with setting up a MOOC when you get no fee income or very little. And how do you assess it? Maybe you don't. But it must be a wonderful advertisement and lead to a lot more students. And I'd be interested to see how these develop in digital humanities and what sorts of things might appear in them. So, just to finish, what have we achieved? Well, I didn't want to categorize an awful lot of things, but here are a few things that stand out. How to maximize investment in the data. All this stuff about language analysis tools, which has kind of disappeared from a lot of digital humanities now, or disappeared a bit, but the precursors of digital humanities had a big input into all of that. I'm thinking particularly of Antonio Zampoli's group in Pisa. Metadata from the perspective of the user and the information manager. User studies, problems looking for solutions. We don't want too many solutions looking for problems, which tend sometimes to exist. And I think a whole host of issues around interdisciplinary working practices. But the main thing, I think, is a critical analysis and reflection. I think in some ways, we've been ahead of the times. The critical analysis and reflection comes from the humanities. So what characterizes digital humanities is not just the capacity to build resources, but the ability to reflect on the activity and discuss the shortcomings as well as the advantages, to build on what's been done and try to find ways of making it better. Well, I think I've ended up asking quite a lot of questions. There's plenty of work to do. I think I feel privileged, and I think we all in this room should feel privileged to be part of a generation who's defining the digital world, what it will look like. And I hope we've all set it off in the right direction. I look forward to reading about what happens in the future as more and more people follow on after Father Busa. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And Susan said that she would take some questions after if you wanted to have a little bit of discussion. Has anyone got any questions you would like to raise or any of the points Susan mentioned?
Yeah.
Over the course of your career, how many philosophers did you encounter?
How many?
How many philosophers did you encounter?
A fairly small number. I think one or two of them might even be in this room. But this is the difference between the doing it and the talking about doing it. And the philosophers, I think, are very much into the talking about doing it. I'm just trying to think. I encountered quite a few when I was just starting in Oxford, but actually they were all studying Aristotle. And I was claiming that one of my star pupils was Anthony Kenny because I taught him how to write computer programs. But yeah, so I have encountered a few, but they were mostly text people. Yeah.
It's true that there are these biases in digital humanities about where it's applied in philosophy.
Yeah.
Philosophy and art history are two of the things that are very opposing different things that we haven't really engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really up to date what philosophers are doing now, but I said this was a long time ago now.
Any other questions?
Hi. Speaking from behalf of the chair of the TEI in this moment, and I have TEI hat on, there are people that say the TEI started too early, and that in a sense blocked the creativity that was bubbling and buzzing around in the 80s. And therefore now it is kind of tired after 30 almost years of activities, and it's time to put it aside, say, okay, we've done it, let's start something new. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I think it did start too early, but there were a lot of people who were really keen to work who had some problems. I don't really follow what's going on with the TEI now, but I guess if it was doing some more interesting things, I might, because I was always excited by the intellectual aspects of what you could do with this. But, the encoded archival description group, when they'd done it, they gave it to the Library of Congress and said, there you are, you look after it. And they got a standard which everybody knows about and everybody uses. And I don't know, I mean, you might know, people here might know more than I do about whether it's being updated very much. But they kind of came to an end. And I think, well, they've been working on some ancillary things related to it now. But I think you kind of end up in the situation where the TEI has been going nearly, can I do my sums right, nearly 30 years. You can get very stale with something. And I think when you get to a certain stage with markup, you're on a kind of brick wall, or you're on an area where lots of different people have lots of different ideas about how to do something. And it's often detailed analysis stuff, which is really quite difficult to do if you want to embed it, with standoff markup or all kinds of things like that. So I don't know what to do what really will happen in the future, but I take your point, and I think I tend to agree with you. And I mean, I was supposedly quite fortunate because I stopped having anything to do with it when they'd finished the first version. Yeah.
I think within the TEI community you have two different groups, and the ongoing, what Elena points at, the creativity does happen, but not in TEI. What I have seen over the last years, and I've been involved in a couple of projects, that they actually see TEI as a deliverable, and they do the creative stuff in another format, and then spit it out as TEI to see, look, we're compliant, and you can make it interchangeable, but the whole creative work happens in a different format.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, actually. I must say, I think I'm still on the TEI discussion list, but I do tend to hit the delete button quite a lot when stuff comes from that. But, you know, I mean, life has changed. I've got other priorities. But I think I tend to agree that some sort of refreshing somehow. And I don't know, I know you've done this introductory stuff for it. I mean, when I was doing it, it was extremely difficult for people to get started. And particularly, I mean, if they had complex intellectual problems they were grasping with, and they had to get together with a markup scheme, and there wasn't any software much to help you put it in, it was really quite difficult to do then.
Yeah, I think TEI by example, there was some tweets flying around yesterday out of nowhere, people like started to talk about how wonderful it was and how it was helped them in the class. That's something we did, well, I can't even remember how many years ago.
Yeah.
About 8 years ago now, and it's still sitting there as a very early prototype of a MOOC. It's all online.
Yeah.
You'll learn it online. And
that's good.
And it just kind of.
I mean, I think, well, I don't really know now, but I imagine there's a big enough TEI community of people using TEI and related things that it won't die. Because if you don't use it when you're starting a project, what do you do? And that's a really good reason why you did your TEI by example, because you've got examples to work with. Yeah.
Any other questions? David?
That was terrific. Tool on the horizon. But one thing you didn't really mention, it seems to be still something of a problem, kind of picks up what Eleanor said, which is that I think the humanities community has never been quite as good as it ought to be about promoting the scholarly benefits.
I agree.
Digital humanities.
I agree. I mean, I had quite a lot more stuff, and I realised I needed to cut it. But I think there's tremendous opportunities for promoting what's done. And there's been, I really don't know what's happening now, but I felt when I was doing things in this area, it can become a little bit inward looking. And clearly, if you're in a university, you've got to produce research, and you're talking to the people who evaluate your research. But I think it needs to be promoted quite a lot more. And there are probably various things that you can do about that. But, you know, marketing was one of the things. Well, it was also called marketing when I lived in America. I had to try and do some marketing because we had to raise some money from institutional subscriptions. And you have to try and find a way to get people to come and then engage them. And they usually get engaged when they, I can see how that relates to what I'm doing now. But I don't know whether that still holds true now. But I take your point, David, and I tend to agree with you about being poor about promotion and marketing. And I go back to what I said now. Since I've retired, I've been dabbling in all kinds of things, but local history, family history. There's a lovely little museum in the village near where we live. It's wonderful, and it's staffed entirely by volunteers. And they're all of the age that didn't grow up with computers, and most of them are still scared stiff of the one computer they've got. But it will change, you know, and I'm afraid I didn't volunteer. You know, the next generation will know about all of these things, and they want to learn a bit more. And something else I deleted because I didn't have time was a quote I saw, I think, on Humanist about 10 days ago about the technologies getting more and more advanced and more difficult to deal with. But everybody coming up now has got past all the introductory stuff. You don't need to teach people how to use a spreadsheet and any of that kind of stuff anymore. Or even how to make a web page, though they might not do it perfectly. So it's getting more advanced, and then it gets more difficult. And it fragments in lots of different directions as well.
Final question, anyone? No? Well, I'm aware now that I'm keeping you from both wine and cake.
Oh, right, cake.
So, can everyone please thank Susan for a fantastic
Well, thank you very much again for inviting me. It's yours.